Russia made $24 billion in 1 month. Not 1 year, not 1 quarter, 1 month. March 2026. And the reason Russia made that money, the reason Russian oil and gas revenues doubled from 12 billion to 24 billion in 30 days is because the United States and Israel are fighting a war against Iran, a war that is supposed to serve American interests, a war that is costing American taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars, a war that has American forces deployed across the Middle East in harm's way. And the primary beneficiary of that war, the country that is profiting more than anyone else from the conflict, is Russia. Let me say that again because I need you to sit with how absurd this is. The United States is spending treasure and risking American lives to fight a war in the Middle East. And the net result is that Vladimir Putin is getting richer. Russia's oil profits in March alone, $24 billion, exceed the entire annual defense budgets of most countries on Earth. And that windfall, that economic bonanza, is a direct consequence of decisions made in Washington and Tel Aviv. Having spent decades inside military intelligence analyzing the strategic consequences of military operations, I can tell you that when the primary beneficiary of your war is your adversary, you have made a catastrophic miscalculation. And what I am about to walk you through, the exact mechanism by which American military action against Iran is enriching Russia, why this dynamic was entirely predictable, and why it reveals fundamental failures in how Washington approaches strategic decision-making, is something every American taxpayer needs to understand. Because your money is funding this, your military is executing it, and Russia is cashing the checks. Now, let me explain exactly how this works, because the connection between American strikes on Iran and Russian profits is not indirect or speculative. It is direct, immediate, and mathematically demonstrable. Oil prices are determined by supply and demand in global markets. When supply is disrupted or threatened, prices rise. When major producers are taken offline or when shipping routes are compromised, the cost of oil increases for everyone. And when oil prices rise, every barrel that Russia sells generates more revenue. Before the United States and Israel launched their strikes on Iran on February 28, 2026, oil was trading at approximately $75 per barrel. Within days of the strikes, as Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz and as markets absorbed the reality that a major oil producer was under sustained military attack, prices spiked to over $100 per barrel. By mid-March, Brent crude had reached $104 per barrel. That $25 to $30 increase, multiplied across every barrel Russia exports, translates directly into billions of dollars in additional revenue. The mechanism is simple, but the scale is staggering. Russia exports approximately 7.5 million barrels of oil per day. That is 225 million barrels per month. At $75 per barrel, that generates roughly $560 million per day in oil revenue, or about $16.8 billion per month. At $100 per barrel, that same volume generates $750 million per day, or $22.5 billion per month. That is a $190 million per day increase in revenue purely from the price spike caused by the Iran war. Over 30 days, that price increase alone adds $5.7 billion to Russian oil income. And that does not even account for the increased demand for Russian oil as global buyers scramble to replace Iranian supply that has been taken offline, or for the higher prices Russia can command from Asian buyers who have fewer alternatives. The Telegraph reported on March 25 that Russia's oil profits had reached $760 million per day. Reuters calculations estimated that Russia's mineral extraction tax on oil output, which is directly tied to oil prices and export volumes, would increase from 327 billion rubles in March to approximately 700 billion rubles in April. That is more than double. And Reuters noted that tax revenue from oil was up roughly 10% compared to April 2025, before the war began. Russia made $24 billion in oil and gas sales in March 2026. That is double the $12 billion Russia made in a typical month before the war. And every dollar of that increase is a direct consequence of the disruption, instability, and supply shock created by the American and Israeli military campaign against Iran. Vladimir Putin did not create this situation. The United States created it, and Putin is simply collecting the profits. Now, let me tell you why this was entirely predictable, because this is not the first time American military action in the Middle East has enriched Russia, and it will not be the last unless the people making these decisions start factoring economic consequences into their strategic calculus. Every time the United States destabilizes a major oil-producing region, oil prices rise. Every time the United States removes a supplier from global markets, whether through sanctions, regime change, or military action, the remaining suppliers benefit. Russia is one of the world's largest oil exporters. Any disruption to Middle Eastern oil supply directly benefits Russian revenues. This is not a secret. This is not a complex economic theory. This is basic supply and demand. And yet, when the decision was made to launch Operation Epic Fury, no one in Washington or Tel Aviv appears to have seriously considered the reality that attacking Iran would hand Russia the largest economic windfall it has received since the Ukraine war began. Let me put this in perspective. Russia has been under Western sanctions since 2022. Those sanctions were specifically designed to cripple Russian oil revenues and deprive Moscow of the resources needed to sustain its war in Ukraine. Europe stopped buying Russian gas. The United States imposed price caps on Russian oil exports. Western countries poured hundreds of billions of dollars into enforcement mechanisms designed to isolate Russia economically and force Putin to the negotiating table. The European Union alone spent an estimated 80 billion euros restructuring its energy infrastructure to reduce dependence on Russian gas. Germany shut down Nord Stream permanently. Poland built new LNG terminals. The entire architecture of European energy policy for the past 2 years has been organized around one objective: stop funding Russia's war machine by cutting off its oil and gas revenues. And then the United States launched a war that spiked oil prices to levels that rendered those sanctions almost irrelevant. Russia is now making more money per month from oil than it was before sanctions were imposed. The economic pressure that the West spent years building, the pressure that cost European consumers hundreds of billions in higher energy costs, the pressure that required painful political decisions and massive infrastructure investments, has been erased in 30 days by a war that Washington claims serves American interests. If you are watching this and you have not subscribed yet, do it now. Because what I am about to explain, why Russia's windfall from the Iran war creates strategic problems that extend far beyond economics and into the sustainability of Western policy on Ukraine, sanctions enforcement, and the broader competition with Moscow, is something that will not be discussed honestly in any mainstream coverage. Subscribe, because the people who made this decision are not going to admit the consequences, and you need to understand them anyway. Let me walk you through what Russia is doing with that $24 billion, because this is where the economic story becomes a strategic disaster. Russia is fighting a war in Ukraine. That war requires money, lots of money. Ammunition, equipment, personnel costs, domestic economic support for families affected by the conflict, subsidies to industries that are operating under wartime conditions. All of that requires sustained revenue. And for the past 2 years, Western sanctions have been designed to deprive Russia of exactly that revenue by cutting off its access to oil and gas income. The Iran war just gave Russia 2 years' worth of sanctions relief in 1 month. The $24 billion Russia made in March 2026 is more than enough to offset any damage Western sanctions have inflicted on the Russian economy over the past several months. It is more than enough to sustain Russian military operations in Ukraine at current intensity for an extended period. And it is more than enough to allow Putin to tell his domestic population that the Russian economy is not only surviving Western pressure, but thriving because of global energy dynamics that favor Moscow. Russia is also using that revenue to expand its influence in the Middle East. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has been conducting shuttle diplomacy between Tehran, regional capitals, and European governments, positioning Russia as the indispensable mediator in any settlement of the Iran conflict. Russia offered in February to take custody of Iran's enriched uranium, a proposal that would make Moscow the gatekeeper for any long-term nuclear agreement. And Russia has been providing intelligence and logistical support to Iran throughout the conflict, strengthening ties that serve Russian strategic interests at the expense of American influence in the region. All of that costs money, and the United States just paid for it by handing Russia a $24 billion windfall in a single month. Now, let me tell you about the second order effects, because the economic impact is only the beginning of the problem. Europe is watching Russian oil revenues double, while European economies struggle with inflation, energy costs, and the political consequences of supporting Ukraine. European leaders justified sanctions on Russia by telling their populations that economic pain was necessary to weaken Moscow and support Kyiv. Now those same leaders are watching Russia rake in record profits, while European taxpayers bear the cost of supporting Ukraine militarily and absorbing Ukrainian refugees. That undermines the political sustainability of European support for Ukraine. It feeds populist narratives that Western policy is making Putin richer while ordinary Europeans suffer. And it creates pressure on European governments to reconsider their approach to Russia at precisely the moment when unity and resolve are most needed. China is watching the United States create economic opportunities for Russia through military action that destabilizes global energy markets. Beijing has been deepening its economic and strategic ties with Moscow specifically because it sees Russia as a useful partner in resisting American dominance. Every dollar Russia makes from the Iran war is a dollar that strengthens Russia's position as a credible partner for China in the broader competition with the West. And every time the United States demonstrates that its military interventions produce unintended economic consequences that benefit its adversaries, China gains confidence that American power is more brittle and less strategically coherent than Washington's rhetoric suggests. And American allies in the Middle East are drawing their own conclusions. If fighting Iran makes Russia rich, and if Russia is Iran's partner, then American military action is indirectly funding the country that is supporting the adversary the United States is trying to defeat. That is a level of strategic incoherence that undermines confidence in American decision-making and forces allies to recalculate whether aligning with Washington serves their interests or simply creates new problems they will have to manage. Let me tell you what the most dangerous aspect of this situation actually is, because it is not the $24 billion Russia made in March. It is the incentive structure that the Iran war has created for Russia to prolong the conflict. Russia benefits from high oil prices. High oil prices are sustained by instability in the Middle East. The longer the Iran conflict continues, the longer oil prices remain elevated, and the longer Russia continues collecting windfall profits. Russia has no economic incentive to help resolve the conflict. Russia has every economic incentive to ensure the conflict drags on, that periodic escalations keep markets nervous, and that the Strait of Hormuz remains closed or restricted for as long as possible. That means Russia, which is positioning itself as a mediator and a potential guarantor of any settlement, is simultaneously benefiting from the absence of a settlement. And that creates a fundamental misalignment of incentives. The United States needs Russia's cooperation to resolve key aspects of the conflict, particularly the uranium issue and Iran's future nuclear status. But Russia's economic interests are best served by ensuring that the crisis continues, generating the conditions that keep oil prices high. You cannot negotiate in good faith with a party whose economic interest lies in prolonging the problem you are trying to solve. And the United States has created exactly that dynamic by launching a war that enriches the one country whose cooperation is essential to ending it. Having been in rooms where strategic decisions are made under pressure, I can tell you that the failure to anticipate this outcome represents a catastrophic breakdown in how the national security establishment assesses the full consequences of military action. Someone should have run the numbers. Someone should have modeled what happens to global oil markets when you take Iranian supply offline. Someone should have calculated what a sustained $25 per barrel price increase means for Russian revenues. And someone should have asked whether handing Russia a multi-billion-dollar economic windfall was an acceptable cost of achieving the military objectives in Iran. If those questions were asked, the answers were clearly ignored. If those questions were not asked, that is an even more damning indictment of the decision-making process. Let me tell you what happens if this trajectory continues, because the pattern is clear and the endpoint is not ambiguous. If oil prices remain elevated due to sustained conflict in the Middle East, Russia will continue making $20 to $25 billion per month in oil revenues, roughly double its pre-war baseline. Over the course of a year, that translates to an additional $150 billion in revenue compared to what Russia would have earned without the war. That is more than the entire GDP of many developed nations. That is enough to sustain Russian military operations indefinitely, to fund influence campaigns across multiple regions, and to insulate the Russian economy from any sanctions regime the West can realistically impose. If the conflict drags on and the Strait of Hormuz remains closed or restricted, global energy markets will adapt by increasing reliance on Russian oil and gas. European countries that reduce their dependence on Russian energy after the Ukraine invasion will find themselves under pressure to resume purchases because alternative supplies are insufficient or prohibitively expensive. That gives Russia leverage it has not had since 2022, and it erodes the effectiveness of the sanctions architecture that took years to build. If Russia successfully positions itself as the indispensable mediator in resolving the Iran conflict, it gains influence over Middle Eastern security arrangements, nuclear proliferation policy, and energy infrastructure decisions that will shape the region for decades. That influence comes at the expense of American leadership and creates dependencies that Moscow will exploit to advance its broader strategic interests. And if American allies and adversaries around the world conclude that the United States makes strategic decisions without adequately considering the economic and geopolitical consequences, that undermines confidence in American leadership and creates opportunities for competitors to fill the gaps that American miscalculations create. All of that flows directly from the decision to launch a war against Iran without seriously accounting for the reality that doing so would make Russia the primary economic beneficiary. Russia made $24 billion in 1 month, March 2026, thanks to Iran, thanks to a war the United States started, thanks to decisions made in Washington that prioritized short-term military objectives over long-term strategic coherence. And the cost of that miscalculation will be measured not just in dollars that flowed into Russian coffers, but in the weakening of the sanctions regime, the emboldening of American adversaries, and the erosion of confidence among American allies that the United States understands the consequences of its own actions. If you have stayed with me through this entire analysis, you understand that the $24 billion is not just a number. It is a symptom of a deeper problem, a failure to think strategically about the full range of consequences that follow from military action. You understand that Russia is not winning by accident. Russia is winning because the United States handed it a victory by creating the conditions that serve Russian interests better than anything Moscow could have engineered on its own. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already, because the economic dynamics driving this conflict are only going to become more important as the war continues. Russia is making money, the United States is spending money, and the gap between those two realities is growing every day the conflict remains unresolved. Pay attention, subscribe, share, because the people who made this decision are not going to explain how it happened. And you deserve to understand what your tax dollars are actually funding.